Okay, I will talk you through how to go through the transfer process using these watercolor pens, and you will have made some adjustments to the notes, from the notes that I will be giving you on your roughs. And I'm just kind of a word of advice is I would like you to talk to me about those questions that you might have in regards to my comments, because obviously I'm just going to be writing up an email and sending it to you, and it might not totally make sense to you. So by all means, we can schedule a Skype session or just a video session so we can talk in person, and I can maybe actually talk you through your questions that you have in regards to adjustments that I would like you to make from the roughs. This is not unlike as if you were to present them to a director in a production meeting, or someone else in the production staff said, well, you know, I've got a couch that I'm going to be borrowing from someplace. I can't reupholster that couch. You know, I really like the colors that you've picked for this particular design, but I would like to have a little more contrast between the couch that we're borrowing and the dress or costume that you're actually going to be making. So sometimes we have to make those adjustments and concessions to our initial vision or our initial decisions. So yeah, don't take it personally if there are questions or not criticism. Usually it's constructive as far as like making you think about some additional texture or colors or ornamentation that maybe you haven't already explored. So the real successful and happy designers are those that can take comments and criticisms from a director or an instructor and make them work within your vision. And not that you're going to totally cave. That's not the point of this either. And just to make the director happy, or if you feel strongly about a decision that you've made, it becomes important for you to adapt it and make it work with the director's vision as well. Okay, so you have your approved adjusted sketch. You're going to go through that transfer process that I talked about a couple of sessions ago, where you're basically just putting pencil lead on the back of your sketch, and then you're going to do the transfer onto watercolor paper. Okay, I just did a little quickie sort of setup because that's kind of like one of the most challenging parts of this, is just sort of getting in the right mindset to paint. Okay, the decision-making process is already done. You've decided your colors, you've decided ornamentation, you decided hairstyle and all of that kind of stuff. So now it's just a matter of like committing it to the rendering, and it shouldn't be a stressful thing, but you have to be prepared with a nice workspace and your supplies that are all available to you. And I will go through that transfer process one more time very quickly, or I will do it off camera maybe and come back to it. So if you remember from when I talked about your supply list, make sure that you go through the steps of going through your pen collection and actually seeing what they look like. If any of you watched the first video that was put along with the schedule for today, I've since found a better one. She talks a lot about her own little personal swatching and the whole 96 pens in the kit, and it's a really long video that I don't think gets to a whole lot of technique. And so I have now posted a better link to a video on just different Arteza brushstroke techniques and blending methods. And make sure you watch that if you haven't already. It's not very long. I want to say it's like maybe 11 minutes, and they go through 16 different process or steps that you can do to use those pens and have effective results when you use them. So you're going to have some sort of a container of water to clean your brushes in. Not brushes, not these brushes. You don't really clean those because that will deplete them of their ink. You can dip them a little bit to get them moist. What I'm talking about is cleaning these water brushes, and the cap just comes off. If you haven't already filled them with water, take this over to the sink and fill your reservoir up with some water and get it all set up so you're ready to go. I do work with a couple of additional brushes just because sometimes these blending brushes, water brushes, are a little clunky sometimes. I don't know. Anyway, so other things that I would like to encourage you to have set up in your setup. I have obviously my watercolor paper, and I also have, where are you? Here. I also have just a scrap piece of paper because unlike the video, I don't like to do a whole lot of blending directly on the rendering. I will do my blending, or at least a trial, a sample of the colors that I'm going to do somewhere off on a little test patch. So just cut yourself a hunk. Yes, you're going to sacrifice one of your pages from your watercolor pad, but this is where you'll need to sort of like practice some techniques, see if you're going to get the texture that you want, or test out a color or a couple of colors. One thing that that video doesn't do a whole lot of, and I would like to encourage you to do more of, is to not just go right from the pen to the paper. Unless it's the perfect color, then my intention is that you're going to do some color mixing. And so we have our blue, we have our yellow, and that's straight from the, I can do it here if I want it fairly saturated. But then remembering what those two colors were that I used to achieve that color that is the perfect color. And maybe your kit has the perfect color. Maybe you don't have to do this process. But it gets kind of like this teal color. You see I'm bringing water over. Okay. I'm going to do my transfer and then I'll come back. Oops. You bought that masking tape, right? Or the painter's tape. This is the place that you would want to use it. Thinking about where you're going to place your figure onto the watercolor paper so it's not floating towards the top. This particular sketch of mine is larger than my watercolor paper, so I'm really having to sort of like fold it up and make sure that my feet are actually going to be traced in the right place. And then you use your painter's tape to secure it to your pad. Ugh, in this case, it's like way bigger than. Okay. And then I can go through safely and do that trace around. I'm going to do it this time with a sharp pen that I have. And like I said, I don't have, what do you call it? Fast forward. So I'm gonna put you on hold and I'll come back. Okay, I think I got everything now. I did have to kind of keep checking to make sure that enough of my figure was transferred. And you do as much as you need to. I chose not to do all those little sort of suggestions of ruffles that I know. So I didn't do any of my feather work in my transfer. But that's enough to kind of get going with what I want to talk to you about. All right. So when I do this for all of my renderings, the first thing that I want to one of the first things that I do is just to kind of get the flow of painting happening. And also so that I can make sure that I have skin dry on my person if I'm going to do any kind of translucent work. Meaning, so like here's one that I was just playing around with before. I will lay in all of my skin so that if in my design I wanted to have sort of like an overlay of chiffon or some other lacy something. Now that this is dry, I can go back in. Where's my yellow? I want to do that a little bit. I can go back in. Oh, that's not my yellow. That was not good. So, okay, that's a good, I mean, here's something you can do. I always also have a little piece of paper towel. I use it as a texturizing tool, like sponging, but that's a good way to sort of like quickly fix an oops. Just basically like use your paper towel. I'm not scrubbing it. I'm just sort of dabbing it and absorbing all that pigment that maybe isn't there. And then I can go back with my brush with some more water. Oh, I'm leaking all over my desk. And I can wash it away a little bit more. But so anyway, if I overwork this, yes, I might come back and pick up a little bit of that underlaying skin color. But more importantly, what I have is I have the skin already in place and it's dry. So that then I can lay that other color that I'm gonna let that dry, and I'll show you how to suggest lace in a little bit. Okay, so on all of them, I will lay them all out, and just to get me going, work on applying some skin tone. As I look at my options here, I would rather not have to mix to it, but I can. They actually have one which is very racist. That's number 71, that they named it as flesh color. Yeah, well, some people's flesh color, not mine. So depending on the color that you would like to use, you know, it's up to you. What is your flesh color? If for all I care, your production could be Avatar. So you've got blue. I mean, I don't think anybody's doing that production of Taming of the Shrew, but you decide. I'm gonna go with oatmeal, I think, which is number 64 on my collection. 64. I can't find it. 64, 75. Oh my goodness, I can't find it. There it is. All right. So one of the techniques that you watched in that other video from THEA is just what's called wet on dry. And this is a little peaked, but so I'm just using my pen to fill in all the places that I have skin. And I can begin to think about highlights and shadows. And so I can think about perhaps a light source. I'll draw it for you to see. Imagine that there's a light source coming from over here. Oops, there you go. I'll move it so you can see. Light over here. You don't have to do that. I'm just giving you an illustration. Light's coming from over here, so meaning anything over on this side of the body is going to be a little bit lighter. Or everything over on this side of the body will be somewhat in shadow. So I'm going to give her skin, her face here, this arm. You don't have to be all scrubby, but watch what happens. Other things that will be darker as you're thinking about highlights and shadows will be anything that is behind something else. So the neck is behind the chin. So this little area is hard because you don't want to have her look like a like she's got a beard. But I'm gonna take my cap off of my water brush now. Give it a little squeeze maybe, or just go ahead and prime it with my water in my cup. And then I can go back in and bring that color over to the lighter side of the body. Are you following me? And immediately it starts to look like a shape, a form. There's just a few little tricks like this that you can do, and it immediately starts to look so much better as far as a more professional, like you thought about kind of the body that's wearing the costume. And I don't need to do the whole thing, but you get it. I'm just sort of softening that edge of that brush pen marker, bringing it over to the other side and leaving it so that there's a concentration over off to one side. And if you don't think there's enough brush pen there, you can certainly go back and bring more in later or right now. It's up to you. Where's the other? There's a hand over here that I forgot to do. Okay. Woo! I got squirted a lot more water than I needed to. Okay. You get the point? Great. Okay. One of the reasons that we do the entire collection of renderings all at once is because now I have to be patient and I have to let this dry before I go ahead and add any other work to it on the fabric or accessories, because I don't want this to bleed. I don't want it to run. As you know, you can see if I had something wet there and I had something right beside it, water that's right beside it, it's going to do what you think, and it's going to bleed into that and pollute your skin. And so we want to make sure that all of the naked parts, all of the skin that's showing, get completely dry before we go on to do the next step. So hang on, I'll come back in a little bit. I'm still waiting for it to dry a little bit. What I can do in the meantime is start to look through my pens and match it up against my colored pencils for color matching. I in this case actually have fabrics, and maybe you do too, that you can match and see what colored pens are going to be closely represented, or if I'm going to have to mix a couple of different colors to get to it. I think, excuse me, I think I'm pretty lucky that I'm looking at a number 22 red that I'm going to pull out. I do have a deep red 260 that I'm going to use, pink, and then this cobalt blue. And I'm not going to probably do a whole lot of mixing right now, but I'm going to do a little testing and see. Yeah, it's a little dark. Well, what does it do when I dilute it as far as that is concerned? But here I'm on my test pad again. It'll be fine. These on the ornamentation, I don't know if you can see, is this sort of like metallic-y, multicolored, rainbow colored fabric. And so I'm going to just sort of like start with that as a base coat, and then I can do some other stuff to modify it. All right, so different steps that we're going to do. I think what I really want to encourage you to do, this is still just wet on dry, wet paper, or sorry, wet ink on dry paper. And I'm leaving it concentrated, and I'm kind of already using my brush strokes to suggest these swags of fabric. And that way I don't have to totally coat this whole thing with my brush ink. I can coat it with just suggestions, and then I can leave some places concentrated to go back in. And I'm going to use probably a bigger brush because I want to use, oops, don't, there we go, big brush. And I'm being light-handed, but letting my brush stroke follow the swags of the fabric so that I can keep those concentrated areas looking like shadows. Okay, don't overwork it. can see it or not. And don't stress about, like, if you happen to go outside of the lines. Like I said, you can take a little bit of a paper towel and just sort of wipe it away. But one of the final steps that we're going to go through is that fine tip marker. And in this case, inside of that skirt is a dark red. That's 22. Where are you? Real brush, deep red, so that it starts to look, and here's, I'm going to do a different technique in here, just so you can see it. Just using, and in doing that, see what I just did? Splattered. It's okay, it's okay. I'm going to clean that brush a little bit with my water. I'll go in here and see how it was bleeding already. I probably should let this outer skirt dry, or go to a different part of the rendering as you're working. And that's kind of the trick. Be patient, give yourself time. That's a big part of this. Don't expect to do it all the night before. I know, surprise. But seriously, if you can sort of map out some days for yourself. And now that I've laid down water there, it's got a little bit of a pink tinge to it. But I can go back and kind of do the reverse with the dark red. Let that bleed, let that spread. And again, I'm leaving concentrations to sort of suggest folds of fabric in there, or I don't have to. I can keep going, just color it in. In your comments, you may have heard me talk about your silhouette. And when I talk about your silhouette, we're looking at how the figure breaks the outline, or the outline of the figure breaks the work. Here's one example of something that you might have had a comment to improve upon, and that is taking and suggesting this overskirt is on top of the other one by bringing that down a little bit. See how that is, the suggestion of this is in front of that. And I don't need it to be like, I'm getting really picky. I'm just giving you tips, I guess, now to help your work, help you be happy with your work. And I am kind of using that in there. Okay, my area over here got dry. If as you're working you have like part of the rendering that is not totally matching the other half because that's how you worked, I mean, don't stress over that. That's I get it. It's frustrating, but that's not what I'm really worried about evaluating you on. The idea of this illustration, of this rendering, is that in combination with the research that you're sharing, the words that you talk, the rough sketch that we've seen, the combination of all those things, and your fabric swatches help us suggest what the final costume is going to look like. I would need to be able to build from it, yes. So there you can see the difference is a little bit wet on wet. Other things that the book or that the previous video talked about and shared was maybe how to take some of that wet area and while it's still wet, dab in some little dots of either salt or a different color, and then let it do whatever it's gonna do. Now I'm deviating from my original design just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. Some techniques with letting the wet on wet spread, and I'm doing it in a pattern to suggest a repeat, as if this were a print. Maybe I'm going to take some green and throw a few veins of foliage in there. Maybe. I'm gonna do it on the more wet side. One thing that I'm glad I watched that video, because I don't know why I had never thought about it, but they did a little stencil technique on the very end. That's pretty cool. Just taking a hunk of some mesh or lace or something, and then coloring it over it, and then removing it, and then you're left with pattern created by the stencil. This is just suggestive, like I said, especially if you've got a swatch that looks something like this, fabric swatch, then the person that's going to be building your costume will know, oh, I see this sort of like swirly dot thing is going to go and match up with that fabric that the designer has included over there. Okay. I don't know that I need to do any more with this. We talked about skin. We talked about how to, oh, I know what I need to do. We need to go over it with a fine tip marker and do the final step. So assuming that you've completed all of your major coloring, you've applied the paint where you want it. This bow is supposed to be like that. I don't know if I want to do that quite yet. I can see how it's bleeding there. It's wet. I'm being impatient. All right. You can, like I said, use your brush and leave that to be brush strokey. You can take an additional color. Where's my additional color? To suggest shadows, maybe. That's really dark. It's really dark. In theory, we could just use these pens to do the outlining, but I don't want it to be in danger of getting wet again or bleeding again. If you look at it when it's all done and you're like, oh shit, that doesn't quite look right. But you've done this outlining in watercolor, it will bleed, it will wash away. So when we do our outlining, excuse me, we will be doing that in a fine tip marker. So I'm gonna go grab mine. You can do colored pencils, but I'll grab my stuff and come back. I'm gonna switch back to this girl. And just to remind you, I'm looking at archival ink microns. This was 0.01 is the tip size. Super, super fine, and it looks razor. If all you were able to acquire is a super fine Sharpie, just be careful. And if you remember, now I'm not doing brush strokey, I'm doing long fluid pen strokes. I'm making sure that I don't want my outlining to get too thick, because if it gets thick, well, I'll go ahead and show you. Like, this is just a regular Sharpie. It happens to be purple, but it starts to look cartoony, and we don't want to do that. It makes it look, I mean, it's okay, but that's not the point. The point is just to give some final definition to the painting that you had done. And maybe those places where you went outside of the line a little bit. Here, go back and give her a little bit more of a shape to the face. Do you remember at the start of the video, this was that overlay of translucency where I was going to come back and show you how to do some lace perhaps. I'm suggesting that this is an irregular edge and just teeny tiny dots with the fine tip marker. So teeny tiny you probably can't even see them in the video, right? I'm following that outline, and I can do it outside of where there's no actual color. But then just a little bit of a repeat of a pattern, and it starts to suggest the look of lace. Can you see that? Maybe if I reverse zoom it. Okay. Again, just a suggestion. This is not photorealism. We're trying to get the person that's looking at this going, oh, I get it. She's got lace there. So I'm going to use this fine tip marker. And maybe, if you remember the original sketch, she had feathers. And the thing that tells the viewer what a feather is how those little hairs break the silhouette or break the outline. And this is very similar to how you're going to do hair as well. Okay? So the hair, think of individual little strands. I've laid in a base coat of a couple of different colors because nobody has just one color hair typically unless they're dyed. And then I'm going to go back in with my fine tip marker and suggest those strands of hair in a hairstyle. We don't want it matted to the head. Maybe you're doing Baptista that is bald, so he might have little tufts of hair off to the side. But can you see how just a few little wisps of that fine tip marker off to the side, don't go that way, it starts to begin to look more hair-like. Here you can do that lace thing again. Okay, so going back in to finish the fine tip marker, if you're not doing any detail, you can do some of this with your colored pencils. Maybe you thought about plaid or stripes, or where the seam lines are going to fall on the garment. See how it starts to come off of the page a little bit better just by adding that fine tip marker. Yeah. And like I said, so maybe something still dries not quite the color that you want it to dry. You can go back over your watercolors. You can go back over this with your watercolors and it won't disturb it. It is a permanent fine tip marker, okay? Great. Play around, experiment. There's no wrong answers. Just make it look like your original sketch. Okay. One final reminder that I want to go through as you prepare, if this were a real submission for you to turn in a hard copy for me to look at, I just want to make sure that you're doing the same stuff, even though you're going to be submitting it digitally to me or through BlackBoard, a photograph of it on BlackBoard. Make sure that if you're using a watercolor paper that has that kind of spiral edge to it, that you are trimming it off to be a neat finished edge, that you have your fabric swatches attached, that you have any kind of construction notes off to the side so that we can understand other components or other parts of your costume that you're thinking about. And then just in general, that all of your lettering is neat and in the same place on each of your plates. So I've got my designer's signature down here. I've got the name of the show. In this case, it's down at the bottom. Sometimes I put it up toward the top. It doesn't really matter as long as it's consistent throughout the plates. This was Drake 10 of 90. Holy crap. Anyway, one of the first shows that I designed here. And then this is character name, actor name, all of that information that we talked about way a long time ago. But that you've taken the time, if you are a bad printer or lettering person, I'm not opposed to having you give yourself a little bit of some very faint pencil guidelines to keep you even, nice, professional looking. And like I said, this is the finished one. Basically, this was old school watercolor with the fine tip marker gone around it and detailed it. I did do a little bit of additional shading on there. You're not required to do that. Still no faces, still no fingers. But that's what your finished plate should look like to look professional.